Black woman married a disabled homeless man, but the truth revealed that wedding changed everything. The first time Jasmine saw him, she almost walked past. It was a Tuesday evening in October, and the Atlanta air carried that crisp bite that warned of winter's approach. Jasmine Clark had just finished her volunteer shift at the downtown food pantry, her arms aching from hauling boxes of canned goods and her heart heavy from the stories she'd heard that day. At 28, she'd been a school counselor for 5 years, and volunteering at the pantry had become her way of extending care beyond the walls of Jefferson Middle School. As she stepped out of the building, fumbling for her car keys in the dim light of the street lamp, she noticed a figure hunched against the brick wall of the adjacent alley. Most people would have quickened their pace, avoided eye contact, maybe even crossed the street. But something about this man made her pause. He sat with his back pressed against the cold brick, his left leg stretched out at an awkward angle that suggested it didn't work quite right. His clothes were layers upon layers, a torn jacket over a faded hoodie over what might have once been a white shirt. His hair was longer than it should be, dark with streaks of premature gray, and his beard was unkempt but not wild. What struck her most were his hands. Despite everything else about his appearance, his hands were clean, and he held a worn paperback book like it was made of gold. Jasmine found herself walking toward him instead of toward her car. "Excuse me," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. "Are you okay?" The man looked up, and that's when she saw his eyes. They were hazel, flecked with green, and held an intelligence that seemed at odds with his surroundings. For a moment, she saw surprise flash across his features, as if kindness was the last thing he'd expected to encounter. "I'm fine," he said, his voice rougher than she'd anticipated, but articulate. "Thank you for asking." There was something in the way he spoke, a carefulness, a precision, that made her curious. She glanced at the book in his hands. "What are you reading?" He held it up slightly, almost shyly. "Marcus Aurelius. Meditations." Jasmine blinked. She'd read that book in college, struggled through it for a philosophy class. "That's not light reading." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "No, it's not." She stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say next. The rational part of her mind, the part that sounded suspiciously like her mother, told her to wish him well and leave. But something deeper, something that had made her become a counselor in the first place, kept her rooted to the spot. "Have you eaten today?" she asked. His hesitation was answer enough. "Wait here," she said, then realized how that might sound. "I mean, if you want to. I'll be right back." She hurried back into the food pantry, where Mrs. Rodriguez was still cleaning up. "Is there any way I could get a meal to go?" Jasmine asked. "There's someone outside who could use it." Mrs. Rodriguez looked at her with knowing eyes. The older woman had been running this place for 15 years and had seen every kind of volunteer come through. "Mija," she said gently, "you can't save them all." "I'm not trying to save anyone," Jasmine replied, though even as she said it, she wondered if that was true. "I just want to help one person have dinner tonight." 10 minutes later, she emerged with a container of still-warm chicken and rice, a bottle of water, and a small bag of cookies that one of the local bakeries had donated. The man, she realized she didn't even know his name, was still there, still reading. "I hope you don't mind," she said, offering him the food. "It's just leftovers from tonight's service." He stared at the container for a long moment before looking back up at her. "Why?" he asked simply. It was such a basic question, but it caught her off guard. Why was she doing this? Because her grandmother had taught her that kindness was never wasted? Because she'd seen too many kids at school who went home to empty pantries? Because something about this man reminded her of the students who sat in her office, guarded and hurting but still hoping someone might see past their walls? "Because you're hungry," she said finally. "And I have food." He accepted the container with hands that trembled slightly. From cold, hunger, or emotion, she couldn't tell. "Thank you," he said, and there was something in those two words that made her chest tight. "I'm David." "Jasmine." She wanted to ask more questions. Where did he sleep? How long had he been on the streets? what had happened to his leg. But instead, she said, "I volunteer here every Tuesday and Thursday evening. If you're ever around." David nodded slowly. "I'll remember that." As Jasmine walked to her car, she found herself glancing back. David had opened the container and was eating slowly, methodically, as if savoring every bite. The book lay open beside him, and she could see him glancing at it between forkfuls. The drive home to her small apartment in Virginia Highland was a blur. She kept thinking about David's eyes, about the way he'd held that book, about the careful way he'd spoken. There was a story there, she was certain of it. When she got home, her phone was already buzzing with texts from her best friend, Monica. "Girl, where are you? Date starts in 20 minutes. Jasmine had completely forgotten. Monica had set her up with some lawyer friend of her boyfriend's, and they were supposed to meet for drinks at a trendy bar in Buckhead. She looked at herself in the mirror. Her hair was a mess from the wind, her sweater smelled like the food pantry, and she was emotionally drained. She texted back, "Rain check? Long day at work." Monica's response was immediate, "Jazz, you can't keep canceling. When's the last time you went on a date?" It was a fair question. Jasmine had been single for almost 2 years, ever since her relationship with Marcus had ended. He'd been a good man, stable, successful, wanted the same things she did. But something had always felt missing, some spark that she'd convinced herself would grow with time. It never had. She looked out her window toward downtown, wondering if David had finished eating, wondering where he would sleep tonight. The next morning at Jefferson Middle School, Jasmine found it hard to concentrate. During her lunch break, she caught herself Googling homeless services in Atlanta, wondering what resources might be available for someone like David. She made a mental note of the closest shelter, though something told her he wouldn't be interested. Thursday couldn't come fast enough. When she arrived at the food pantry that evening, she found herself scanning the alley before she even went inside. David wasn't there, and she felt a surprising stab of disappointment. She threw herself into her volunteer work with extra energy, helping sort donations and serve meals to the long line of people who came through their doors. It was nearly 8 o'clock when she finally stepped outside, and there he was. In the same spot, with the same book, wearing what looked like the same clothes. "How was Marcus Aurelius?" she asked, approaching him with a container of food she'd set aside. David looked up, and she could swear she saw relief in his expression. "Profound as always. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." "Heavy thoughts for a Thursday night," Jasmine said, settling down beside him on the steps. She'd brought a small blanket from her car and spread it out. "Heavy times call for heavy thoughts," David replied, accepting the food gratefully. "How was your day, Jasmine?" The question caught her off guard. When was the last time someone had asked her that and genuinely seemed interested in the answer? She found herself telling him about her students, about the 8th grader who was acting out because his parents were getting divorced, about the girl who was brilliant but convinced she was stupid because she learned differently. David listened intently, asking thoughtful questions, offering insights that surprised her with their depth. He seemed to understand the weight of caring for others, the way it could fill you up and drain you simultaneously. "You're good at what you do," he said after she'd finished talking. "How can you tell?" "Because you see people," he said simply. "Really see them. That's rarer than you think." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the occasional car pass by on the street. Finally, Jasmine worked up the courage to ask, "David, how long have you been out here?" His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "A while." "Do you have family? Friends who might?" "No," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "There's no one." Jasmine wanted to press, wanted to understand, but she recognized the wall that had just gone up. She'd seen it countless times in her counseling sessions, the moment when someone decided they'd shared enough. "Well," she said, standing and folding up the blanket, "you've got me now. Tuesdays and Thursdays, remember?" As she walked away, she heard him call softly, "Jasmine?" She turned back. "Thank you for seeing me." That night, Jasmine lay in bed thinking about those words. For seeing me. Not for the food, not for the kindness, but for seeing him. She wondered how long it had been since someone had really looked at David, had seen past the circumstances to the person underneath. She also wondered why she cared so much about a man she barely knew. The answer to that question would change everything. But first, she had to get through the whispers that were already starting to follow her around the food pantry, the concerned looks from Mrs. Rodriguez, and the phone call she knew was coming from her mother, who somehow always found out when Jasmine was doing something she considered too dangerous, or too generous for her own good. What Jasmine didn't know, what no one knew, was that David sat in that alley every Tuesday and Thursday not because he had nowhere else to go, but because he was waiting. Waiting to see if there were still people in the world like her. People who would stop, who would see, who would care without expecting anything in return. And as he finished the meal she'd brought him, reading by the light of his phone's flashlight, David wondered if he'd finally found what he'd been looking for all along. The test had only just begun. 3 months had passed since that first evening, and what started as simple kindness had grown into something Jasmine couldn't quite name. Every Tuesday and Thursday, she found herself looking forward to those conversations in the alley more than anything else in her week. David had become her anchor in ways she hadn't expected. While her days were filled with the chaos of middle school drama and teenage emotions, her evenings with him brought a peace she'd never known. He listened to her stories about difficult parents and struggling students with the kind of attention that made her feel heard. Really heard. "Tell me about the boy again," David said one cold December evening, accepting the thermos of hot soup she'd brought. "The one who's been acting out." Jasmine settled beside him on the thick blanket she now kept in her car specifically for these moments. "Trevor. His parents are going through a nasty divorce, and he's caught in the middle. Today he got into a fight with another kid over something completely stupid." "What did you tell him?" "That anger is easier than sadness," she said, surprised at her own honesty. "That sometimes we lash out because it feels better than feeling helpless." David nodded thoughtfully. "You understand him." "I was him once," Jasmine admitted. She'd never told anyone that before, not even her closest friends. "When my dad left, I spent 6th grade picking fights with anyone who looked at me wrong. What changed? My grandmother. She saw through all my anger and just loved me anyway. She'd sit with me while I cried, never trying to fix anything, just being there." Jasmine's voice caught slightly. "She died when I was in college. I became a counselor because of her." David reached over and gently squeezed her hand. His touch was warm despite the cold, and something electric shot through her at the contact. "She'd be proud of you." It was such a simple statement, but it undid her completely. Tears she'd been holding back for weeks spilled over, and before she knew it, David's arms were around her, holding her while she sobbed against his shoulder. "I'm sorry," she whispered, pulling back and wiping her eyes. "I don't know why I'm falling apart." "Because you carry everyone else's pain," David said softly. "Someone needs to carry yours sometimes." That was the moment Jasmine knew she was in trouble. Not the kind of trouble her mother would worry about, but the kind that made her heart race and her stomach flutter. The kind that made her count hours until Tuesday. By January, their conversations had evolved from her problems to deeper topics. David spoke about literature and philosophy with the passion of someone who'd studied both extensively. He could quote Rumi and debate the merits of different systems with equal ease. He knew art history, could discuss music theory, and had opinions about architecture that made her see buildings differently. "How do you know all this?" she asked one evening after he'd spent 20 minutes explaining the significance of Byzantine mosaics. David's expression grew guarded. "I read a lot." It was always the same answer when she asked about his past. He'd deflect, change the subject, or simply go quiet. But Jasmine had learned to read the pain behind his silences, the way his jaw tightened when certain topics came up. What she didn't know was that every deflection was a test. Every time she accepted his boundaries without pushing, every time she let him keep his secrets while still choosing to stay, David felt something inside him crack open just a little more. The first time she brought him winter clothes, he almost broke. "I can't accept this," he said, staring at the heavy coat, warm gloves, and thermal socks she'd pulled from a shopping bag. "It's supposed to get down to 20 degrees tonight," Jasmine said matter-of-factly. "And I saw you shivering last week. Jasmine, I can't pay you back. I'm not asking you to." The simplicity of that statement hung between them. David looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his expression. Something that looked almost like wonder. "Why?" he asked, the same question he'd posed that first night. This time, she had a different answer. "Because I care about you." The words hung in the cold air between them, heavy with meaning. David's eyes searched her face as if looking for deception, for some hidden motive. When he found none, he carefully put on the coat. "It fits perfectly," he said quietly. Jasmine had spent 2 hours at the store, holding different sizes up to memory, trying to get it right. "Good," she said, her cheeks warm despite the cold. That night, David didn't sleep. He sat in the doorway of an abandoned building where he'd been staying, wearing the coat that smelled faintly of her perfume, and wondered when this woman had become the most important person in his world. Meanwhile, Jasmine's world was becoming increasingly complicated. The whispers at the food pantry had grown louder. Volunteers talked when they thought she couldn't hear, speculating about her homeless boyfriend, and whether she was being smart or stupid. "Mija," Mrs. Rodriguez said one evening, cornering Jasmine in the storage room. "I need to talk to you." Jasmine's stomach dropped. "If this is about David." "It is." The older woman's expression was kind but firm. "I've been doing this work for 15 years. I've seen good people get taken advantage of, get hurt, get their hearts broken by men who can't be saved. David's not like that." "How do you know? What do you really know about him?" It was a fair question, and Jasmine didn't have a good answer. She knew David was intelligent, kind, and listened to her like no one ever had. She knew he made her laugh and made her feel understood. She knew that when he looked at her, she felt like the most important person in the world. But she didn't know where he came from, why he was on the streets, or even his last name. "I know enough," she said finally. Mrs. Rodriguez sighed. "Just be careful, okay? Sometimes our hearts see what we want to see, not what's really there." The conversation haunted Jasmine for days. Was she being naive? Was she projecting her own desires onto a man who was essentially a stranger? Her doubts evaporated the following Tuesday when she arrived at the alley to find David helping an elderly homeless woman who'd collapsed nearby. He'd given her his coat, called 911 on a phone that seemed far too expensive for someone in his situation, and was speaking to the paramedics with the calm authority of someone accustomed to emergencies. "Is she okay?" Jasmine asked, approaching as the ambulance pulled away. "Dehydration and exhaustion. She'll be fine." David looked at Jasmine with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You're early tonight. I was worried about you. It's been snowing all day." Something in his face softened. "You were worried?" "Of course I was worried. The words caught in her throat. She'd been about to say, "I love you," and the realization hit her like a physical blow. She was in love with him. Completely, irrevocably in love with a man whose last name she didn't even know. David must have seen something in her expression because he stepped closer. "Jasmine? I need to tell you something," she said, her heart hammering. "I don't care that you don't have money or a house or whatever it is you think I need. I don't care what anyone says about us. I care about you. More than I've ever cared about anyone." David went very still. "You don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying." She stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his hazel eyes. "I'm saying I love you, David. I love your mind and your heart, and the way you make me feel like I'm the only person in the world who matters." For a moment, David looked like he might run. Then, slowly, carefully, he reached up and cupped her face in his hands. "I love you too," he whispered. "More than you'll ever know." When he kissed her, Jasmine felt like she was coming home to a place she'd never been. It was gentle and desperate and perfect, and when they broke apart, she saw tears in his eyes. "What's wrong?" she asked, alarmed. "Nothing," he said, pulling her against him. "For the first time in years, absolutely nothing is wrong." What Jasmine didn't see was the expensive watch David quickly covered with his sleeve, or the way he scanned the street for cameras that weren't there. What she didn't know was that this moment, this declaration of love from a woman who knew him only as a homeless man, was exactly what he'd been waiting for. The test was nearly complete. Soon, he would have to decide whether to reveal the truth or disappear forever. But first, he wanted just a little more time to be loved for exactly who he appeared to be. 6 months later, on a warm evening in July, David did something that shocked everyone who knew their story, including Jasmine herself. They were sitting in their usual spot in the alley, sharing Chinese takeout that Jasmine had brought after an especially difficult day at school. David had been quieter than usual, more contemplative, turning something over in his hands that she couldn't quite see. "Jasmine," he said suddenly, his voice carrying a nervous tremor she'd never heard before. She looked up from her lo mein to find him kneeling beside her on the blanket, his hazel eyes intense with an emotion that took her breath away. "What are you doing?" she whispered. "Something I should have done months ago." He opened his palm to reveal a ring made from twisted copper wire, simple and beautiful in its imperfection. "I know I don't have much to offer you. I know people think you're crazy for loving me. But I also know that you see something in me that no one else does, and I can't imagine spending another day without you in my life." Jasmine's hands flew to her mouth, tears already spilling down her cheeks. "Will you marry me?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Will you take a chance on a man who has nothing but love to give you?" The word yes escaped her lips before she even realized she was speaking. David slipped the wire ring onto her finger with hands that shook slightly, and when he kissed her, Jasmine felt like her heart might explode from pure joy. "I love you," she whispered against his lips. "I love you so much it scares me." "I love you too," he replied, and there was something in his voice, relief, triumph, and a deep sadness she couldn't understand. "More than you'll ever know." The next week brought a whirlwind of reactions that ranged from shock to outright horror. Jasmine's mother, Patricia, drove down from Savannah specifically to stage what she called an intervention. "Baby, I know you think you're in love," Patricia said, pacing around Jasmine's small living room like a caged animal. "But marriage? To a homeless man? What about children? What about your future? What about happiness, Mama?" Jasmine interrupted. "What about love? What about the fact that David treats me better than any man I've ever known? He's using you, sweetheart. Can't you see that? He's found himself a meal ticket and—" "Stop." Jasmine's voice was firm. "Just stop. I know what I'm doing." But Patricia's words echoed in her mind even after her mother returned to Savannah in a huff. Monica was more diplomatic but equally concerned, offering to pay for a background check, just to be safe. Even Mrs. Rodriguez pulled her aside at the food pantry. "Mija, I've been thinking. Maybe you should slow down, take some time to really get to know him before you make such a big decision." Jasmine wanted to scream that she did know David. She knew he was kind and intelligent and made her laugh. She knew he could discuss Shakespearean sonnets one moment and help a drunk man find his way home the next. She knew he had nightmares sometimes and woke up calling out names she didn't recognize. But she also knew they were right about one thing: there was so much about his past that remained a mystery. The strangest thing happened when they started planning the wedding. Jasmine had assumed it would be a simple courthouse ceremony, maybe with dinner afterward at a modest restaurant. They had no money for anything elaborate, and she was fine with that. David, however, had other ideas. "I want to handle the arrangements," he said one evening, his tone oddly formal. "David, we can't afford. Let me worry about that." He took her hands in his eyes serious. "This is important to me, Jasmine. I want our wedding to be perfect. Will you trust me?" Something in his voice made her nod, even though alarm bells were ringing in the back of her mind. How could a homeless man handle wedding arrangements? What was he planning? Over the next few weeks, David disappeared for hours at a time, claiming he was taking care of things. When Jasmine asked for details, he'd smile mysteriously and change the subject. He seemed different during this time, more confident, more purposeful, as if he was finally in his element. Then, 3 weeks before their planned wedding date, David took her to see the venue. Jasmine's jaw dropped as they pulled up to St. Augustine Chapel, a stunning Gothic Revival church in one of Atlanta's most exclusive neighborhoods. The building was all soaring arches and stained glass windows, the kind of place that charged thousands of dollars for weddings. "David, we can't afford this," she whispered as they walked through the ornate wooden doors. "It's taken care of," he said simply. Before she could ask how, an elderly man approached them. He was distinguished looking, with silver hair and kind eyes, wearing an expensive suit that Jasmine recognized as designer even though she couldn't afford such things herself. "You must be Jasmine," the man said, extending his hand with a warm smile. "I'm Reverend Charles Wentworth. David has told me so much about you." Jasmine shook his hand, noting his firm grip, and the way he looked at David was something that seemed almost like pride. "It's nice to meet you, Reverend. This is a beautiful church." "Thank you. I've been here for many years." He gestured around the sanctuary. "David thought you might like the acoustics. The way sound carries in here is quite remarkable." As they toured the chapel, Jasmine found herself growing more confused. The Reverend spoke to David with a familiarity that suggested they'd known each other for years, not weeks. He mentioned details about the ceremony that David couldn't possibly have discussed with him, things about her favorite flowers, her love of classical music, even her grandmother's maiden name for some reason. "How do you two know each other?" Jasmine asked finally. David and Reverend Wentworth exchanged a look that lasted just a moment too long. "Oh, David and I go way back," the Reverend said smoothly. "He's like family to me." But family didn't explain how David had managed to book this venue, or how he'd arranged for the flowers that were exactly what she would have chosen, or how he'd somehow secured a string quartet for the ceremony without spending a dime. That night, Jasmine lay awake staring at the ceiling, turning the day's events over in her mind. David slept beside her on the air mattress in her living room. They'd been staying together more often lately, though he still disappeared some nights without explanation. She studied his face in the moonlight streaming through her window. Even in sleep, there was something regal about his features, something that suggested he'd been born to finer things than alley conversations and food pantry meals. "Who are you really?" she whispered into the darkness. David stirred slightly but didn't wake. If he had, he might have told her that in just 2 weeks, she would have her answer. That everything they'd built together was about to be tested in ways either of them could imagine. That the man sleeping beside her was about to change both their lives forever. But for now, he kept his secrets, and Jasmine kept her questions, and the wedding preparations continued under a cloud of mystery that grew thicker with each passing day. The biggest surprise was yet to come. The morning of their wedding dawned clear and bright, with golden September sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows of St. Augustine Chapel. Jasmine stood in the small bridal room, smoothing down the simple white dress she'd found at a consignment shop, her hands trembling with a mixture of excitement and nerves. Monica stood behind her, adjusting the small pearl necklace that had belonged to Jasmine's grandmother. Despite her initial reservations, her best friend had ultimately chosen to stand by her side. "You look beautiful," Monica said softly, though her voice carried an undertone of worry. "Are you sure about this, Jazz? Really sure?" Jasmine met her friend's eyes in the mirror. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Outside the bridal room, she could hear the gentle murmur of guests taking their seats. The guest list was small, a few colleagues from school, some volunteers from the food pantry, her mother who had reluctantly driven down from Savannah. David had no one, which had broken Jasmine's heart when she'd asked about invitations. "Just you," he'd said. "You're all the family I need." At exactly 3 o'clock, the string quartet began playing Pachelbel's Canon, and Jasmine's heart raced as Monica opened the door. The chapel looked like something from a fairy tale, with white roses and baby's breath adorning every pew, candles flickering in ornate holders, and afternoon light casting rainbow patterns across the stone floor. But what took her breath away was David, standing at the altar in a perfectly tailored black suit that fit him like it had been made for his body. His hair had been cut and styled, his beard neatly trimmed, and for a moment, Jasmine barely recognized the man she'd fallen in love with. He looked distinguished, wealthy even. Their eyes met as she began her walk down the aisle, and his face lit up with a smile so radiant it made her forget every doubt, every question, every warning she'd received. This was right. This was love. Nothing else mattered. Reverend Wentworth stood waiting for them, his silver hair gleaming in the candlelight, his expression warm and somehow expectant. As Jasmine reached the altar and took David's hands, she noticed something strange. There were cameras positioned discreetly around the chapel, professional equipment with operators she didn't remember seeing during their rehearsal. "Who are they?" she whispered to David. "I'll explain later," he murmured back, squeezing her hands. "Trust me." The ceremony began beautifully. Reverend Wentworth spoke about love transcending circumstances, about seeing the true heart of a person beneath surface appearances. His words seemed carefully chosen, almost as if he was speaking to a larger audience than the small gathering before him. "Marriage," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the chapel, "is the ultimate test of unconditional love. It asks us to choose each other not for what we have, but for who we are." Jasmine felt tears prick her eyes. These words felt like they were meant specifically for her and David, a validation of their love despite what others thought. They exchanged rings. David had somehow procured a simple gold band for her, while she slipped a matching band onto his finger next to what she now noticed was an expensive-looking watch he'd never worn before. "Now," Reverend Wentworth said, "let us hear the vows you've written for each other." David went first, his voice steady and clear as he spoke about second chances and the woman who had seen his worth when he couldn't see it himself. Jasmine was crying openly by the time he finished, overwhelmed by the depth of emotion in his words. She began her own vows, talking about how David had shown her what real love looked like, how he taught her that wealth meant nothing compared to richness of spirit. As she spoke, she noticed the camera operators moving closer, and something nagged at the back of her mind. "I promise to love you whether we have everything or nothing," she concluded. "Because having you means I already have everything that matters." Reverend Wentworth smiled broadly. "Beautiful words," he said. "Before we continue, however, there's something that needs to be shared." Jasmine felt David tense beside her. "What's happening?" she whispered. The Reverend removed his glasses and set them aside, his demeanor shifting from gentle officiant to something more formal, more authoritative. The camera operators moved into position, and Jasmine realized they were now recording everything. "Ladies and gentlemen," Reverend Wentworth said, his voice carrying a new weight, "I must interrupt these proceedings for a very important revelation." Gasps echoed through the small congregation. Jasmine's mother half rose from her seat, confusion written across her face. Monica looked like she was about to charge the altar. "My name is Charles Wentworth," the Reverend continued, "and I am the founding trustee of the Wentworth Foundation, one of the largest humanitarian charities in the world." Jasmine's mind reeled. The Wentworth Foundation? She'd heard of it, everyone had. It was a billion-dollar organization that funded schools, hospitals, and disaster relief efforts across the globe. "The man standing beside you, Jasmine," Charles continued, his eyes kind but serious, "is not who you think he is." David's grip on her hands tightened, and she saw something in his eyes that looked like both apology and hope. "This is David Wentworth III, my grandson and the sole heir to the Wentworth fortune. For the past year, he has been living undercover among Atlanta's homeless population as part of an extensive social experiment." The chapel erupted in shocked murmurs and gasps. Jasmine felt the blood drain from her face as she stared at David, at the man she thought she knew. "The experiment," Charles continued, raising his voice above the commotion, was designed to test a simple but profound question. In a world obsessed with wealth and status, does true love still exist? Can someone love another person purely for who they are, not what they have? Jasmine's legs felt weak. She looked at David, searching his face for some sign that this was all a terrible joke. But his expression told her everything she needed to know. "You've been lying to me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the chaos in the chapel. "This whole time, you've been lying." "Jasmine, please let me explain." "Explain what?" Her voice was rising now, tears streaming down her face. "Explain how you've been playing games with my life? How you made me fall in love with someone who doesn't even exist?" The cameras captured every moment of her heartbreak, every tear that fell as the truth shattered the beautiful lie she'd been living. The test was over. But had love passed or failed? The answer would change everything. The chaos in the chapel was deafening. Jasmine stood frozen at the altar, her white dress suddenly feeling like a costume in someone else's play. Around her, guests erupted in confused chatter, some standing, others pointing, all trying to process what they just heard. "Please, everyone, please sit down," Charles Wentworth called out, his authoritative voice cutting through the noise. "Let me explain everything." But Jasmine couldn't hear him over the roaring in her ears. She stared at David, or whoever he really was, searching his face for some trace of the man she'd fallen in love with. The expensive watch on his wrist, which she'd glimpsed but never questioned, now gleamed like evidence of her own foolishness. "You're a billionaire," she whispered, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. "Jasmine, please." David reached for her, but she stepped back, nearly stumbling on her dress. "Don't touch me." Her voice cracked. "Don't you dare touch me." Charles cleared his throat, commanding attention once again. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every moment of her humiliation for what she now realized must be some kind of documentary. "The Wentworth Foundation," Charles began, his tone measured and professional, "has always been committed to understanding human nature at its most fundamental level. 3 years ago, my grandson came to me with a profound disillusionment about the world he'd grown up in." David's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt as his grandfather continued. David had just ended an engagement to a woman named Victoria Ashford, a socialite who had professed her love for him for 2 years. When he lost a significant portion of his trust fund in a bad investment, temporarily, as it turned out, she left him within a week. She told him she could never love a poor man. Jasmine felt Monica's hand on her shoulder, but she shrugged it off. She didn't want comfort. She wanted answers. That betrayal shattered David's faith in genuine human connection. Charles continued. He became convinced that in our materialistic society, true love, love without condition or expectation, no longer existed. He challenged me to prove him wrong. The older man's eyes swept across the small congregation, many of whom were now hanging on his every word despite their shock. So we devised an experiment. David would live as the most marginalized member of society, homeless, disabled, with nothing to offer except his character. If someone could love him in that state, purely for who he was as a person, it would prove that authentic love still exists in our world. Jasmine's mother stood up abruptly from her pew. "You used my daughter as a lab rat." Patricia's voice shook with fury. "You manipulated her emotions for your sick little test. Mrs. Clark, please understand." "Understand?" Patricia was advancing toward the altar now, her eyes blazing. "You let my baby fall in love with a lie. You watched her defend a man who didn't exist, watched her sacrifice her reputation, her relationships, her peace of mind, all for your entertainment. It wasn't entertainment." David spoke for the first time since the revelation, his voice strained. "It was never that." He turned to Jasmine, his eyes pleading. "Everything I felt for you was real. The love, the conversations, the way you made me feel human again, none of that was part of the experiment. How can I believe anything you say?" Jasmine's voice was barely above a whisper, but in the stunned silence of the chapel, everyone heard her. "How do I know what was real and what was performance?" Charles stepped forward, his expression gentler now. Because, my dear, you passed every test we never even gave you. Jasmine looked at him with confusion. We never tested your reaction to wealth, he explained. We never dangled money in front of you or offered rewards for your kindness. We simply watched as you chose love over logic, compassion over convenience, again and again. He gestured to the cameras. These recordings show a woman who brought food to a stranger not once, but dozens of times. Who bought winter clothes with her own limited money. Who defended a man everyone told her to abandon. Who chose love when it offered her nothing but heartache and criticism. Mrs. Rodriguez from the food pantry was crying openly now. Mija, she called out. We all tried to warn you. Because you all saw what the world taught you to see, Charles said firmly. A homeless man who couldn't possibly be worthy of love. But Jasmine saw a human being. He turned back to her, his eyes kind but serious. The cameras recorded something else, too. They recorded David falling genuinely, desperately in love with a woman who saw past everything society told her mattered. David stepped closer, and this time Jasmine didn't move away. I never meant for it to go this far, he said, his voice breaking. The experiment was supposed to last 6 months. But then I met you, and you were everything I'd given up believing existed. You were kind without expecting anything in return. You were intelligent and funny and saw beauty where others saw only problems. Tears streamed down his face. You loved me when I was nothing, Jasmine. When I had nothing to give you but conversation and gratitude. You loved the worst version of myself that I could create. But it wasn't the worst version, Jasmine said suddenly, her voice stronger than it had been since the revelation began. It was still you, wasn't it? Your mind, your heart, your soul, those were real. David nodded, hope flickering in his eyes. The man who quoted Marcus Aurelius, who helped that elderly woman, who listened to my problems and made me feel understood, that was really you. Every conversation, every moment, every feeling, it was all real, Jasmine. More real than anything I'd ever experienced in my privileged life. The chapel had gone completely silent. Even the cameras seemed to pause, waiting for her response. Jasmine looked around at the faces staring at her, her mother's anger, Monica's concern, Mrs. Rodriguez's tears, the curiosity of strangers who had stumbled into the most important moment of her life. Then she looked back at David, at the man who had lied to her about everything except the one thing that mattered most. Her next words would determine not just their future, but whether love had truly passed the ultimate test. The whole world was watching. And Jasmine finally understood that this moment wasn't the end of their story. It was the beginning. The silence in St. Augustine Chapel stretched like a held breath. Jasmine stood at the altar, her wedding dress rustling softly as she turned to face David fully. The man before her looked the same as he had minutes ago, the same hazel eyes, the same careful way of holding himself, the same vulnerability she'd seen that first night in the alley. But everything else had changed. You want to know what I think? Jasmine said finally, her voice cutting through the heavy quiet. David nodded, not trusting himself to speak. I think you're both idiots. Gasps echoed through the chapel. Charles Wentworth's eyebrows rose in surprise. You, she said, pointing at Charles, designed an experiment to test whether love exists. But you forgot the most important part. Love isn't a test. It's a choice. Every single day, it's a choice. She turned back to David, and her voice grew stronger. And you spent so much time trying to find out if someone could love you with nothing that you forgot to ask if you could love someone despite everything. David's face crumpled. Jasmine, I'm not finished. She held up her hand, and he fell silent. For 10 months, I chose to love a man who sat in an alley reading philosophy books. I chose to love someone who listened to my problems and made me feel understood. I chose to love a person who helped strangers and treated me like I mattered. Her voice began to shake, but she continued. The fact that you had money hidden away somewhere doesn't change any of that. The fact that you could have been living in a mansion instead of a doorway doesn't change who you were when we were together. She stepped closer to him, close enough that only he could hear her next words. But lying to me? Letting me defend our love to people who called me foolish when you could have ended my humiliation with a single phone call? That changes everything. David's face went pale. I know, and I'm sorry. I was so afraid that if you knew the truth, you'd love the money instead of me. I was terrified of losing the only real thing I'd ever had. So instead you built our entire relationship on a lie. Yes. The word came out broken. And I've regretted it every day since I realized I loved you. Jasmine closed her eyes, feeling the weight of every gaze in the chapel. Her mother's anger, Monica's concern, the curiosity of strangers, the rolling cameras documenting her most private moment for the world to see. When she opened her eyes, she looked past David to Charles. You said this was a test to see if love exists. But you tested the wrong thing. Charles frowned. I don't understand. You tested whether I could love David without money. But the real test is whether David can love me with honesty. Whether he can trust me enough to be vulnerable without props or performances. She turned back to David, and her voice dropped to a whisper. So here's my question for you, David Wentworth III. Right now, in front of all these people, with cameras rolling and your secret exposed, can you tell me why you love me? Not why you love the woman who passed your test, but why you love me, Jasmine Clark, exactly as I am? David's eyes filled with tears as he reached for her hands. This time, she didn't pull away. I love you, he said, his voice clear despite his tears. Because you see people's hearts before you see their circumstances. I love you because you're brave enough to care about students everyone else has given up on. I love you because when the world told you I was worthless, you chose to see my worth anyway. His grip on her hands tightened. I love you because you brought me food not to save me, but because you saw that I was hungry. I love you because you listened to my opinions about books and art and philosophy like they mattered, even when you thought I was nobody. I love you because in your eyes, I was never nobody. The chapel was completely silent now, everyone hanging on his every word. But mostly, David continued, his voice breaking. I love you because loving you taught me who I really am underneath all the money and privilege and fear. You didn't love a homeless man or a billionaire, you loved me. The real me. And I want to spend the rest of my life proving that man is worthy of your love. Jasmine felt tears streaming down her cheeks. Around them, she could hear soft crying from the congregation, her mother, Mrs. Rodriguez, even some of the strangers who had witnessed their story unfold. Now you know everything, David said, echoing the words from her brief but making them entirely his own. But nothing has changed for me, except that I love you even more for loving me when I was at my most afraid to be loved. Jasmine looked into his eyes, those same hazel eyes that had captured her attention 10 months ago, and saw the truth she'd always known but had been afraid to trust. I didn't love the worst version of you, she whispered, just as she had in her brief. I loved the truest version of you. She turned to Charles, her voice stronger now. Your experiment worked, Mr. Wentworth. Love does exist. But not the way you think. Charles leaned forward, intrigued. Real love isn't loving someone despite their flaws, Jasmine said. It's loving someone because of their whole truth. David lied to me about his circumstances, but he never lied to me about his character. And his character is what I fell in love with. She turned back to David. I choose you. Not because you passed some test, not because you have money, and not because this makes a good story for your cameras. I choose you because when I strip away everything else, the wealth, the deception, the experiment, what's left is a man who makes me want to be the best version of myself. David's smile was radiant as he leaned down to kiss her, but she held up a finger. However, she said, and his face fell slightly, if we're going to do this, we're going to do it honestly. No more tests. No more experiments. No more lies, even the ones you think will protect me. I promise, David said solemnly. Complete honesty from now on. Good. Jasmine grinned. Then let's get married. The chapel erupted in cheers and applause as David kissed his bride. Flash bulbs went off, cameras rolled, and somewhere in the celebration, Jasmine heard her mother crying, happy tears this time. As they broke apart, David whispered in her ear, "I have one more confession." Jasmine raised an eyebrow. "Already breaking your promise?" "The ring," he said, looking down at the simple copper wire band on her finger. "I made it myself. Even with all my money, that's the ring I wanted to give you. Because it represents what we built together, something simple and beautiful and real." Jasmine laughed, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "Now that," she said, "is the man I married." Later, the story of their wedding would spread across news channels and social media, inspiring millions of people around the world. David would return to his foundation work, but with Jasmine by his side, using their platform to advocate for the homeless community that had unknowingly helped him find love. But in that moment, in that chapel filled with music and laughter and the chaos of unexpected joy, there was only truth. Only love. Only the beginning of a story that proves sometimes the best things in life come disguised as the worst, and sometimes, just sometimes, love really can conquer all. Even lies. Even tests. Even the fear that real love might not exist. Because it does. And they had found it in the most unlikely place of all, in each other's complete, imperfect, honest truth.